Today is March 3rd, 2024. This is Jackie Beckett, and I am interviewing Cynthia Gensheimer. I don't think I said that right, Cynthia.
No, that's perfect.
At my home in Englewood, Colorado, for the Colorado NCJW Oral History Project. Good morning. Well, I think we're almost afternoon. Good morning or afternoon, whichever it is, Cynthia.
To you too.
Yeah. I wanted to just start with some background about you. So could you tell me where you were born?
I was born actually in Indiana. My parents were there very briefly. While my dad was getting a PhD in physics, he had a postdoc there at Indiana University. And then we moved to Schenectady, New York when I was 2, and that's where I grew up.
Great. And will you tell me your parents' names, please?
Sure. It's Norman, Francis, and Beverly Cohen.
Great. And what did they do?
My mom was an elementary school teacher, and she taught full-time until she was pregnant with me, and then according to the norms of the times, she had to quit when she was pregnant. So she took some time off to raise her 3 daughters, and then went back to become a favorite substitute teacher at the local elementary school. My dad was a nuclear physicist, and he designed the propulsion systems for nuclear-powered submarines, and he worked at a research laboratory in Schenectady that was run by GE, but actually worked for the Navy.
Great. And when you were growing up, do you have siblings?
I have 2 younger sisters, yes.
Yeah. So the 3 girls were growing up in your household. Tell me about your home. Was it a religiously Jewish home, not so religious? How was it?
We used to joke that my parents' marriage was a mixed marriage because my father grew up in a very traditional Orthodox home. But by the time he went to the Navy, he was writing letters home about, to reassure his parents that he wasn't hungry. He was writing letters home about having eaten a big chicken dinner and finishing it off with a pint of ice cream. So he had, and being a member of a scientific community that was pretty skeptical about religion at that time, I would say, he had drifted away from formal observation, but felt very identified as a Jew throughout his entire life. My mother came from a Reform family. She had been confirmed at the Reform congregation in Rochester, New York, the big Reform congregation there, and they had both grown up in Rochester. So to make a long story short, they joined the Reform congregation. There in Schenectady was a small town, still is, now it's an even smaller town, but there were only 3 congregations, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, and we belonged to the Reform congregation, where we were very involved, and they were very involved. I was active in the Temple Youth Group, and pertinent to this conversation, I had a summer job, 2 summers running, through a program that was new at our temple where the congregation funded teenagers who are members of the congregation to go and do social work, essentially, in the toughest neighborhoods in Schenectady. So that began my interest, really, in trying to figure out how to solve some of the world's problems of poverty and racism and things like that.
What a great way to start. So tell me about your high school years. Where did you go to high school?
I attended the public high school there in Schenectady, and I had a fabulous high school education. And I've always loved learning, and I was very lucky to go to a high school where there were top-notch teachers and amazing fellow students, because many of my classmates were children of the scientists who worked at these 2 big research labs in Schenectady. So the competition was tough, and the friendships forged there were tight.
Great. Were you ever involved in Jewish activities in your high school?
Yes, I was involved in the youth group. Sadly, for a small city, the Reform Jews had their own youth group, the conservative kids had their own youth group, and the Orthodox had their own, and I didn't even know which other students at my high school were Jewish necessarily, so that was a terrible shame. But during the summer, I went to summer programs run through the through NFTY, the National Federation of Temple Youth. That was the Reform movement, and I went to conclave, so I was pretty active in that sort of thing.
Oh, great. Were you bat mitzvahed?
I didn't have a bat mitzvah because when I was in 4th grade, we moved to Boston for 1 year. My dad was a visiting professor at MIT, and that would have been the year that I started Hebrew school. When we went home, my parents homeschooled us but didn't teach me any Hebrew, so when we went back, they put me in Hebrew school with the kids a year younger, and I balked. I said, I'm not going to Hebrew school with those little kids, and they didn't care enough to force me to do it, I guess. So I didn't have a bat mitzvah. One of my younger sisters did. Mm-hmm. And then I studied Hebrew in college because I felt so bad that I had missed out on that opportunity.
Okay, were you confirmed?
Yes, it was a very, I might have been the only one in my confirmation class who thoroughly enjoyed the intellectual aspects of it. The other kids, including the rabbi's son, were fidgeting, or he had his head on the desk most of the time, but I loved our rabbi, and he had a huge, Michael Senes, he was a war refugee from Hungary. He spoke with a thick accent and was a friend of Abraham Joshua Heschel's, and he just seemed holy to me, and thoroughly, he had not a material concern in the world. He was very active in promoting civil rights, and many of his sermons were unintelligible, but he spoke from the heart and was very pious, and I was lucky enough when he died to get some of the books from his library.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a wonderful story. So after high school, did you go to college?
I went to the University of Rochester, where I majored in math and economics. Never took a class in history, sadly. Placed out of the English class, so I never learned how to write very well. But I got a great education in math and economics.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And after that?
After that, I went to UCLA and I got a PhD in economics. And that was a terrific experience too. While
you were in your post-high school educational classes, did you ever get involved in Jewish activities?
For a while, well, as I said, in the summer after my freshman year in college, that was one of the years that maybe both summers, I can't remember exactly when I was a member of that Temple Community Service Corps that I told you about, but one of the years at least was after my first year of college. So I did that. I went to Hillel a little bit, but Hillel at the University of Rochester at that time was really run by Orthodox Jews from New York City, and coming from upstate New York, where Jews were such a very small minority, and we didn't talk about being Jewish. We just tried to blend in. We had Jewish friends, but most of my close friends, it was a mixture. I had close friends who were Jewish and close friends who were not Jewish. So to make a long story short, in graduate school, I did nothing Jewish except once my husband and I got married, we had a Seder, just the two of us in our little apartment. But afterwards, we realized that we had it on the wrong day. We were just that disassociated from everything Jewish at that time.
In terms of religious observation in your home with your husband versus when you were a young girl, what was your religious observation like?
Oh, that's an interesting question. When I was young, we went to services. Living in a small city at that time, we went to services probably at least once a month, and friends of ours would be there and sitting in the same pews. It was a very tight-knit community. We went for all the holidays, and I certainly went to Sunday school religiously, if you don't mind my using that word. And we tried to replicate that experience for our own children. But I would say that in a way, my religious observance as an adult may have been a little bit more intense than my parents, because we tried to have a nice meal every Friday night and light the candles, whereas that was not my experience growing up. And we tried to more fully celebrate holidays, I guess I would say.
Okay. Do you belong to a congregation?
Yes, we belong to HEA, the Hebrew Educational Alliance here.
All right. How'd you come to Colorado?
Oh, that's kind of a long story, but to make a long story short, we were living in Massachusetts. We had one daughter here in Denver, and she was about to be married to a Denverite, and our married son was living in California with his wife and 2 children, and our youngest one was at that time, and probably still is, what we call our wild card. And so we weren't sure where she was going to wind up, but she was living in California, and so we decided to move to Denver just to be closer to our children. And that was at a time when we were both retired. Well, I was sort of retired.
Before that, were you in Kansas City, I recall?
We lived in Kansas City for 12 years, and before that we were in Poughkeepsie, New York, Washington, D.C. My husband and I met in California, but immediately before, and we also lived in Connecticut, but immediately before moving to Denver, we were in Amherst, Massachusetts.
Okay. So a little bit all over.
A little bit all over.
During your time, have you ever experienced anti-Semitism?
You know, that's something, of course, I've been thinking about a lot recently. I only had 2 overtly anti-Semitic incidents occurred to me during my entire life that I can pinpoint. I don't know what was going on behind the scenes. In high school, there were sororities. I was never invited to join a sorority, but I think that was more because I was a nerd than because I was Jewish. But when we lived in Washington, D.C., where we had our first jobs after graduate school, we were once eating at a fancy restaurant, my husband and I, and a man at an adjacent table used the term, he tried to Jew me down. I had never heard that term in my life, and I was really shocked. Then probably about 10 years ago, or shortly after Lyft, or I guess it was Uber, when Uber first was probably the first time we ever used Uber. We were in Los Angeles and we needed a ride to the airport. And the Uber driver was ranting and raving about a Jewish businessman. And I am normally a very shy kind of person and non-confrontational, but I felt incumbent upon myself to speak up, and I did. And it surprised even me, and I think also surprised my husband. And luckily, the driver didn't seek any retribution or say anything nasty in return.
Okay. Let's back up and talk about your career, because I know you've had quite a career. So you graduated with your PhD in California, and tell me about your career.
From Los Angeles, Joe and my husband had finished law school, and so we set out to move to a city on the East Coast where we both could find interesting work. And he wound up at the Justice Department, and I wound up at the Congressional Budget Office. So I worked at the Congressional Budget Office for 5 years, analyzing tax issues, and I was in the tax division of the Congressional Budget Office. I wrote congressional testimony. I think I published 5 reports on different topics that were issues under consideration by the U.S. Congress at that time. I, at one point, met with a senator, and I would answer questions of reporters, listen to lobbyists' concerns. Our basic job was to read the research and think about a problem from the perspective of an economist, and then translate, when we were writing either a speech or a report, try to translate our findings into plain English so that the congressional staffers who were our audience would be able to understand it. We were actually told not to put many, or if any, graphs in our reports, to minimize the number of tables. And I was sent to a course, I took a course for a week on how to write without using any jargon, because when you finish a PhD program and have to write a thesis, you write in a certain very pedantic, boring style, and I had to learn how to write in a little bit more engaging style. My husband got an invitation to take a job in Connecticut, so we moved to Connecticut, and I was finishing up a report on ways in which the individual income tax could be revised for the Congressional Budget Office. And this was well before people were working remotely, but they agreed to keep me on. And so I was working in Connecticut where our first child was born and trying to juggle it all. And I wound up deciding it was too tough and I would take a short break from work. So I took a few years off. We had another child. And when Joe got a job in Poughkeepsie, New York, working for IBM, I started teaching economics at Vassar College, and I did that for 5 years, and that was a terrific experience for me. I taught public finance and calculus for economics majors, which was very difficult to do, and I taught intermediate micro theory. And then out of the blue, my husband got a call about a job in Kansas City, and to humor him, I said, oh, go out and find out about it. And then thinking he would never be interested, he came home and he said, I think you'd really like living in Kansas City. So before I knew it, we lived in Kansas City, and I knew that his job was going to be very demanding. And we had 3 children at home. We wound up taking in a fourth. A friend of our son's lived with us during the high school years. So I really had my hands full trying to maintain some semblance of a normal family life. But I got involved in doing a lot of volunteer work there in Kansas City, and it was fabulous and very interesting. I got to pick and choose pretty much what I worked on. So I was statewide legislative liaison for the PTA of a school district that had 25,000 students. I was on the committee of the Jewish Book Fair, and I got to go to the airport and pick up famous authors like Harold Kushner and have private conversations in the car. Stephen Dubner was another one, just a wonderful conversationalist. And probably most importantly, I became the vice president of the Jewish Community Foundation, and starting out on the board of that organization. And it was through that I became a historian in a kind of a strange way.
The person who never took history or English in college became the historian.
Well, I was in charge of a strategic plan, and we had meetings periodically every couple of weeks, and for some reason, to this day, I can't really tell you why, I decided to start out by putting our work in historical context. And the conundrum that was at the root of my inquiry, I think, was my trying to understand how my father's mother, my grandmother, could be so generous when she didn't have any money in her bank account, but she never let anybody leave her house empty-handed, and she had little, we called them pushkis, little charity boxes that where she collected money, and in those days, people would come knock on the door, and she would invite them in, offer them a cup of tea, and give them the contents of the money that she had collected in these little boxes. So I was wondering, why is it that now I'm sitting on a board trying to figure out ways to induce very wealthy Jews to be more charitable when my grandmother was so generous when she had nothing?
It's an interesting dynamic, huh? So how did you get involved with NCJW?
It was through that. When I tried to figure out how the history of the charity of Jews who lived in Kansas City, I discovered a rabbi who had kept a diary in Kansas City, and in fact throughout his entire career. And in his diary, because the 19th century was a time of self-reliance when people, and a time when almost everybody had a religious affiliation. Ministers and rabbis were responsible for caring for their own. And so this rabbi's diary laid out how he worked with the women of his communities wherever he lived to solve the problems that faced them. And that led me to the National Council of Jewish Women, and to trying to understand what motivated the women who were involved in NCJW to be involved in an organization of Jewish women trying to promote the Jewish religion, education, and charity.
So you did some research on NCJW's women founders.
Yes, especially Hannah Solomon. I was a fellow at the American Jewish Archives, and I spent 2 weeks simply reading the handwritten letters that Hannah Solomon's daughter, Helen, wrote home from a year she spent at Wellesley College, 1901 to 1902. And Helen found herself in all sorts of, it was a very pervasively Protestant college, Wellesley was at that time. And so Helen found herself in all sorts of awkward situations, and she wrote home to her mother, "Do you think I did the right thing?" And so through reading this correspondence, I developed a sense of their religiosity, their very close ties to Judaism, and what it meant to be a leader of Reformed Jewish women at that time, which was just after Hannah Solomon founded the National Council of Jewish Women in 1893. So this was within the first 7 years of the founding of the organization. And I knew that the Jewish women, I knew that Hannah Solomon was religious, but she wasn't religious in the sense that my charitable grandmother was religious. They shared a common concern and an obligation for caring for Jews in need, but the way in which they observed being Jewish was completely different. My grandmother kept a kosher home. The Solomons ate whatever they wanted to. They thought that the laws of kashrut were outdated and outmoded and unfit for living in a modern world. The Solomons were Reformed Jews. They had ditched practically all Hebrew from their services. The services were, their rabbi preached from the prophets, and it was all in English, trying to appeal to a modern congregation. So, whereas my grandmother's congregation, the women were seated separately. They never were allowed to go on the bima. They didn't read from the Torah. It was a completely different kind of religiosity.
So at some point you came to be familiar with the history of NCJW as a whole, as well as the NCJW Colorado section. And I know that you were going to share with us today that history so that we have that piece in our oral history as well.
Sure. Would you like me to go ahead and read this?
Yeah, that would be great.
Sure. When we moved to Denver, I knew that I already had several friends. Seraphine Pisco, Carrie Benjamin, Frances Weisbart Jacobs. These women, all long dead, paved the way for hundreds of impressive Coloradans who have led the NCJW during its 130 years here. The NCJW became a chief vehicle for informing Jewish women about social problems and giving them a concrete way to get involved personally and make their voices known politically. Carrie Shevelson Benjamin, and 5 other women from Denver were among the 93 Jewish women from around the country who assembled in Chicago in 1893 for the Jewish Women's Congress, held as part of the Columbian Exposition. Hannah Solomon convened the women after being rebuffed by Jewish men who refused to allow them to speak at the World Parliament of Religions. Carrie had achieved national fame in 1881 when she was the first Jewish woman to graduate from Syracuse University. After teaching high school Latin and Greek, she married a Denver businessman and moved here in 1890. One of a select few women to speak at the Jewish Women's Congress, Benjamin's address on woman's place in charity established her place as a national philanthropic philanthropic leader, arguing in favor of a modern scientific approach to alleviating poverty. Benjamin also echoed the traditional belief that women are by their nature uniquely suited to this work. She spoke frankly to wealthy women, urging them to expand women's sphere to include suffrage, reform, and charity, with charity the most important of the three. At the conclusion of the Congress, the National Council of Jewish Women was formed, uniting all American Jewish women with one of its foremost goals to promote what Hannah Solomon called preventive philanthropy. Carrie Benjamin became president of the inaugural Denver section, which quickly became the country's second largest section and its model for philanthropic work. By 1920, it had 700 members. Just after World War II, it had 2,000 members. Carrie, like other NCJW founders, felt that the new woman could revitalize her religion and accomplish great things. Think of a charismatic president of a startup that required each volunteer employee to roll up her sleeves and get to work, person to person. This startup was nimble and took on new projects, but abandoned those that didn't work. It innovated, and like today's successful startups, some of its best projects got sold, in this case taken over by other Jewish groups or government. It advocated for legislation to improve the lives of women and children. Denver established study circles that met in members' homes. Carrie said, "We really got on familiar terms with the family Bible, and in turn gave of our best to those who needed the best in us. The Denver section held its first meetings at Temple Emmanuel, and the group was called the Temple Council. Temple Emmanuel was staunchly Reform, and Rabbi Friedman spoke at every meeting." This was true generally, and throughout the country, the local Reform rabbis took a very strong role initially. But Carrie Benjamin was born in Eastern Europe, and in 1895, the local section hosted a kosher picnic. Rabbi Kavar of BMH later had a strong influence, and the Denver section was an especially tolerant one. This was important because although nearly all study circles disbanded, most other projects involved helping Eastern European immigrants. There was animosity between the groups of established German Jews and the newcomers, but NCJW leaders tried not to be condescending. Seraphine Pisco spoke of all that established Jews could learn from their immigrant brothers and sisters. A sense of the women's personal dedication and their involvement in the broader community can be gleaned from the untimely death of Dora Kerngood Weil at the age of 29 during the Spanish-American War. An NCJW tribute read, "Morning after morning at 6 o'clock was she at the station, the railroad station, personally supervising the giving of a warm meal to the soldiers and sailors passing through. All day long on her wheel," that meant her bicycle, "she rode from family to family who needed her cheerful presence or helping hand. At death, Weil was president of Denver's section of NCJW, secretary of the Women's Club of Denver, and treasurer of the Denver Educational Alliance. In many cities, including Denver, NCJW work was the entree to work in the broader community, and women, Jewish women, through their NCJW affiliation, were viewed as Jewish women within the broader community. The local group concentrated on philanthropy, and Carrie Benjamin and later Seraphine Pisco chaired the National NCJW Committee on Philanthropy. Benjamin's committee disseminated pamphlets on subjects including duties of friendly visitors. These were women who went house to house to pay a visit, appear friendly, tried to befriend the people she was helping at the same time that she was dispensing what she considered to be helpful advice. Benjamin lined up speakers for national conventions. The speakers shared overall strategies, local successes, and challenges. Denver women established and taught Sunday school. They volunteered teaching sewing and English, hosting programs for immigrant mothers, and leading summer outings for children. They set up a Jewish corner at the public library. They set up kindergartens and night schools, both later taken over by the public schools. Some of their most impressive work was done with Ben Lindsay, Denver's juvenile court judge, who urged councilwomen to keep immigrant Jewish boys off the streets. A year after council instituted social and educational programs for boys in the West Colfax area, the number of Jewish boys appearing before the juvenile court dropped from 30 to 4. Seraphine Pisco was a probation officer, and she and counsel worked with Judge Lindsay over a period of over 20 years. She later remarked upon the number of Denver lawyers who got their start in debate clubs at counsel after-school programs. Pisco joked that when she visited Europe in 1904, people asked her, "Denver, how far is that from Chicago?" 5 years later, they said to her, "Oh yes, Denver, home of the great juvenile court judge." Around that time, Denver politicians refused to renominate Lindsay for the court, but Denver women pushed to have him on the ballot as an independent, and he won more votes than the Republican and Democratic candidates combined. Denver's council established a home for working girls, but disbanded it after ascertaining it was not needed. Nationally, NCJW fought the white slave trade. This was girls who were going into prostitution. Council members met ships at Ellis Island to protect young immigrant girls. In Denver, NCJW women met the trains at Union Station to do the same thing. Many women worked with NCJW for decades. Tilly Levy joined in 1918 and reflected upon her 60 years by emphasizing the women's personal service, visiting hospital patients and children in correctional homes, and participating in the Big Sister program. In the late 1930s, Jews in Denver were given almost no time to figure out how to help Jewish refugees arriving desperately from Europe. Tilly said, "We had council women and businessmen who were able to procure jobs. It's almost unbelievable that within 24 hours we had a group going and we were already able to help. We found apartments, bought food, and had women to meet them at the train." The group also found homes in Denver for 6 German Jewish refugee children. Right from the start, beginning with personal service, Denver's members expanded into advocacy to improve public education, expand rights for women, and protect children. American Jews knew Denver's women for their leadership on state, city, and national charity boards. Women in Colorado earned the right to vote in 1893, decades before the rest of the country. Carrie Benjamin spoke at an NCJW conference in New York in 1896. When Hannah Solomon introduced her, Solomon said, "Mrs. Benjamin voted on the winning side at the last election." This, of course, was big news, as it was the first presidential election since Colorado women were given the vote. "Yes, I did vote for McKinley, and I'll tell you why," Benjamin said. "It was because my husband asked me to vote on the other side." Carrie Benjamin, Seraphine Pisco, and Ray David traveled to conventions around the country, and in Pisco's case, even represented the U.S. at an international women's conference. They were all members of non-sectarian women's clubs in Denver, clubs that also advocated for women and children. When asked about what effect suffrage had on Colorado's women, Pisco replied that it encouraged women to take an interest in issues, quote, relating to schools, charities, cleanliness, morality, and the beauty of the cities. Colorado women were soon serving on school boards and elected to the state legislature. Pisco said, entirely through the efforts of the women, kindergartens and manual training were introduced into the public schools. A state home for dependent children was established. The age of consent was raised from 14 to 18 years through the women legislators. Also, a law making the mother joint guardian of her children with her father. Previously, women did not have guardianship rights. 17-year-old Clara Ruth Mosor wrote an essay on the status of women in 1909. The daughter of poor Jewish immigrants, she worked in a settlement house in the West Colfax area, and in 1916, she became the first woman assistant attorney general in the entire country, with jurisdiction over laws affecting women and children, including those then under consideration in Colorado to pay women a minimum wage, grant them maternity leaves, and monitor child labor. Council work continued throughout the 20th century, with women providing hospitalities for soldiers stationed here and lobbying for support for the new state of Israel. As government assumed much of the responsibility for Council's early programs, women refocused their efforts to entertain and educate impoverished children, fund scholarships for women, aid the blind, deaf, developmentally disabled, and elderly. Jewish Family Services took over some of Council's work, including refugee resettlement. Over the past 50 years, Council members led important efforts to improve interfaith relations and push for civil rights and reproductive rights for women. They advocated for children through CASA and volunteered with day programs for seniors, and with Call a Cab. Children's lives were transformed through the Magic School Bus and Children's Traveling Theater. Members devoted countless hours to raising funds for NCJW through the Bargain Center and the Elegant Fall Fashion Review. Working together while doing good, these women forged lifelong friendships. Clearly, even as the nature of NCJW's work evolved over the decades, the personal commitment of NCJW members remains strong. Glenda Kaufman told me that in her position in charge of state public affairs for the council in the 1980s, she regularly spent 4 days a week at the Capitol. Marlena Siegel recalled how her mother welcomed refugees being resettled in Denver in part by inviting them home for dinner. When I asked Doris Lackner whether she considered her work as NCJW president and on the national board to be a job, she told me, speaking of herself and her coworkers, it was our careers. And now Jackie Beckett, former just recent past president, she's past president now of the Colorado section of NCJW, is serving on the national board of NCJW too. Today, with most women working full-time outside the home, the nature of NCJW involvement is changing, but the emphasis remains the same: to come together as Jewish women to educate, advocate, and improve the lives of Coloradans, particularly women and children. That's the end.
Thank you so much for preparing that for us. Your work has been amazing in categorizing our history as an organization and the women that made it so strong and so wonderful.
Thank you, Jackie.
How did you yourself were a member of NCJW?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes? How did you decide to join the organization?
Ooh, that's a tough question to answer. I think for sure I first joined when we lived in Kansas City, and it was because I had friends in the organization and I came to understand the nature of the good work that they were doing. And then when our youngest daughter had her bat mitzvah, as part of the process, she had to do some volunteer work, and she decided to donate a portion of her of the gifts that she received to start a program through Kansas City's National Council of Jewish Women to provide free eye screenings with local ophthalmologists for children who didn't have health insurance and otherwise might not be able to see the blackboard at school, and therefore, I guess they don't use blackboards anymore, but anyhow, whose academic success was really a function of their being able to see well, and we still support that program.
What are you the most proud of about NCJW?
I think through, as I look as a historian back over this long 130-year history, and I listened to the stories that I did a lot of the interviews for this project as Jackie did, and listening to the women relate their own personal experiences, I think that from the very beginning, NCJW served to empower Jewish women, and because it was a nationwide organization, it served as a means of sharing best practices, exchanging ideas, having the ability to draw in top-notch speakers and research, and it has done a tremendous amount to foster a sense of Jewish community among Jewish women, at the same time that it enabled them to do a great deal of good.
Great. What do you think makes NCJW unique?
I think that when you look at Jewish women's organizations, Jewish women have been active in supporting their congregations through sisterhoods, and nationally in the United States there have been Zionist organizations, and especially Hadassah, which supported the medical care in Israel. But if you look at national organizations for Jewish women, NCJW is the one that has concentrated on domestic issues of great import.
Great. And how's NCJW affected your life?
Well, that's interesting. I would say that I have made terrific friends through NCJW, and I've drawn a great deal of inspiration through studying the work of NCJW leaders over time.
Great. Have you ever belonged to any other Jewish well, you've told me about several Jewish organizations that you not only belong to, but served on their boards. Any others that you haven't mentioned?
I've been involved in sisterhoods of our congregations. I served as a volunteer librarian. I organized the books with the help of a friend who shared the job with me in Kansas City. We organized all the books in the library, which up until that point were in a haphazard system. I belong to Hadassah, and I've spoken to Hadassah. Here in Denver, I'm a board member of the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society, and I'm a member of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Colorado. I've spoken before both organizations. And now I'm writing a book about the first Jews who attended the Seven Sisters colleges, and so I spoke on a national Jewish Gen Zoom program, and I've spoken at some of the colleges. So I have my many fingers in many different pots.
Yes. Some of the work you've done on NCJW may fit with this new book that you're writing.
Absolutely. I could talk for another hour and a half about that, because many of the first Jewish students at these colleges had mothers who were active in NCJW, and that I think is it shows really these colleges, the graduates of these colleges formed an old girls network. NCJW was absolutely integral in terms of creating a nationwide network for women, where they shared not only their thoughts about furthering Jewish education, philanthropy, and religion, but they shared their thoughts about how to bring up their daughters to be independent, forceful women, even a step above what they'd been able to accomplish.
Great. Well, I really appreciate your taking the time today to enlighten us about the history that the women we've interviewed don't have firsthand knowledge of, because no one was here in 1890, in the 1890s. But I wanted to just ask you before we finish, is there anything else you wanted to share that I haven't asked you about?
I don't think so. I think I went on and on far too long.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you, Jackie.
Okay, cut.
All right.